Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back. Welcome to episode 1 of Basic Anatomy Concepts. We're going to be discussing some really critical concepts that will be key in your journey in studying anatomy in the future. So some of these concepts will include sort of how we label body structures, how we talk about direction, and like frames of reference, just so that everyone can be referring to the same things when we talk. And really language is just so important, especially when it comes to science. So this is just going to make sure that we have all of the terms ready to use at our disposal. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is the structural hierarchy of an organism. As we all know, we're made of cells, and you may have learned maybe in biology class that cells are the basic building blocks of life. So they're like the smallest unit that we can really call alive. And the thing about multicellular organisms like ourselves and other animals and plants is that breaking down larger organisms into smaller parts really helps us compartmentalize our functions. For instance, each cell has a separate job and it does its own job. And then cells come together to form tissues, which you see is the next sort of tier on this pyramid. And then multiple tissues together form organs. And then multiple organs can work together to form organ systems. And together, all of these put together form an organism. So some examples of tissues that we talk about are, for instance, epithelial tissues, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and nervous tissue. These are the 4 main kinds of tissue, and we'll go over that a little bit later. And then when tissues come together, you need at least 2 different types of tissue to form an organ. So for example, the brain is composed of both nervous tissue and connective tissue. The heart is composed of, you have some muscle tissue, you have some connective tissue holding parts together, you have nervous tissue also to stimulate the heart to pump, and you have some epithelial tissue. So the heart has all 4 broad types of tissue. And then organ systems are systems of organs that kind of have a common goal in mind. So for example, the cardiovascular system, right? You have the heart and the blood vessels, and together they work together to pump blood throughout the body and to deliver oxygen to the body cells. So the organ systems that we'll be talking about this year are the integumentary system, the skeletal system, and the muscular system. So each of those has a separate sort of purpose, right? The integumentary system, it has multiple functions, and we'll talk about that. But sort of its broad overarching purpose is to protect the body structures that are inside and to separate the interior of the body from the exterior. The skeletal system obviously is to provide structure for the body and to protect like the inner organs also. And the muscular system has an obvious function, which is to generate movement. All right, the second sort of basic concept I wanted to talk about is homeostasis. Homeostasis, basically it means sort of maintaining a steady state in the body where you don't have huge fluctuations. And so you sort of achieve this like dynamic equilibrium or dynamic balance. And this is notably different than just straight up equilibrium or static equilibrium, because equilibrium means that nothing is changing in your body. There are no changes and everything is just like flatlining. If an organism is at equilibrium, they would be dead. But if they're at homeostasis or dynamic equilibrium, that's a very different thing. We're responding to changes in our environment or changes within ourselves, and we're having feedback loops that help us maintain homeostasis at a steady level. So there are 2 types of feedback loops that help us maintain homeostasis. The first type and the most common type is negative feedback. So on here, I have sort of the basic logic circuit for a negative feedback loop. So you start off with a stimulus, which activates a sensor, which activates an effector, and that goes on and inhibits the stimulus. So when you look at sort of like a pathway like this right here, typically you'll see the use of like pointed arrows, meaning that something activates or something promotes or stimulates something else. And when you have like a flat arrow here with like the little T at the end, that means it's stopping something or inhibiting something. So in this case, there are some very common examples of negative feedback. One example is regulation of blood glucose. And I know this isn't like intimately related to anything we're talking about this year, but it's just a very classic example. Let's say that you had a piece of chocolate cake, and that brings in some glucose into your blood because your body like absorbs the food and the glucose is absorbed. So the stimulus would be the increase in blood glucose. However, that's like not necessarily really good for your body to like every time after you eat, your body increases the amount of glucose in your blood, because then like eventually you just like have a massive amount of glucose. So your body needs to respond to that, right? So that activates a sensor. And so there are cells in your body that sense the amount of glucose. And then in response, that will cause an effector. And the effector in this case is the release of insulin, which is a hormone released by your pancreas. And what that does is that when it binds to cells, it stimulates cells to take up glucose from the blood. So cells take up glucose from the blood, and that essentially inhibits or kind of stops that initial stimulus because it brings back it brings the blood glucose level back down to a reasonable level, and homeostasis is maintained. You have a similar case where if suddenly your blood glucose drops below a critical level, there's a different hormone that's released called glucagon, and that has the opposite effect of making cells release glucose into the blood. So through the action of both of these hormones, you maintain homeostasis. And that's sort of like a general overarching concept in biology. Some other examples are thermoregulation, which is regulation of body temperature, and osmoregulation, which is like regulation of a balance of like electrolytes and water in your body. Okay, so that's negative feedback. The other type of feedback, as you might have guessed, is positive feedback. So positive feedback is less common because essentially you have a stimulus activating a sensor, which activates an effector, and that effector like amplifies the stimulus even more. So it's probably clear to you why this is not super common, because this doesn't help maintain homeostasis. This actually drives you further away from that sort of equilibrium point. So in the case of blood clotting, you have a wound and that activates platelets, which are a type of like cell fragment that stops you from bleeding essentially. And those platelets secrete a factor that helps recruit more platelets onto the scene, which helps that clotting even further. So basically that's the point. Is that you get more and more. And eventually this positive feedback loop does need to be shut off by some external factor. So the next thing that's really important for us to talk about is anatomical position and directional terms. So it's really important in science to make sure that we're all using the same terms, so that we all know what we're referring to. And that's the purpose of anatomical position and directional terms. So in general, anatomical position is just the person on the left on this diagram right here, where someone is looking at the camera, the frame of reference, body facing, and the arms are pointed sort of like outward with the thumbs directed outward. So his palms look like this, and he's standing there like this, but like with his arms extended because like my camera's too small. But that is anatomical position. And the reason that we have this is so that when we talk about body parts with relation to each other, it's not contingent on how the subject is positioned. For example, if we say that like your head is above your shoulders, that's generally true, but like what happens if the person's standing on their head? Well, then that's not the case anymore. So we need to make sure that whenever we're talking about like a hypothetical position, we're always thinking about the same position. And then tied in with that are directional terms, which are these terms that you see on both the diagrams and on the right here. On the right, I sort of sorted them by like opposites, which you also see in the colors on the left. So like jumping right into it, superior and inferior are opposites. And broadly speaking, superior means above and inferior means below. So for example, your head is superior to your shoulders. And in this case, we don't need to say your head is superior to your shoulders in anatomical position, because we just assume that we're always talking about anatomical position. Ventral and anterior mean the same thing when you're talking about humans. This isn't really the case for animals, but with humans, they're interchangeable, as well as dorsal and posterior. So that just means like front and back, generally speaking. So anterior is front, posterior is back. Medial and lateral mean closer and farther away from the midline, respectively. So the midline is like the line running down the center of your body, splitting you into two symmetrical halves. So as you can see on the arrows on the left that are blue, medial is toward the center, lateral is away. Proximal and distal are usually talking about with respect to like a limb. Proximal is going to be closer to the joint, that's like closer to the center of your body, and distal is away from the center of your body. So for example, your hand is distal to your shoulder and your shoulder is proximal to your hand. And lastly, superficial and deep are opposites. Superficial means closer to the surface or the skin. Deep is further away from the surface of your body. Also on here, they have like in the hot pink arrows, they have two other pairs, palmar and dorsal and plantar, and those are specific to the hands and feet. So I know dorsal like meant back generally, and it usually means the same thing as posterior, but with the hands and feet, this is like slightly different. So dorsal means like the back of your hand or the back of your foot, and the palmar means like your palm, or plantar means like the sole of your foot. So that's just like specific to those parts of your body. All right, so here I have an exercise. Take a minute and like pause the video to fill this out for a second. And also attached to this video, you should have a handout of these slides, but you can, I've like hidden a slide that shows the answer. So you can like take a look at that hidden slide after you're done and see if your answers match. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about is body planes. This is especially useful when we're talking about sections of the human body. For example, like when we're taking a scan, when you take like a scan of the interior of someone's body, it has to be a two-dimensional picture, right? We have to like view one plane at a time. And which way we sort of like mentally slice that image really depends on the plane along which the person is sectioned. So there are three main body planes, as you see in this picture. The sagittal plane sort of runs like front and back through the person vertically. And a special sagittal plane is called the mid-sagittal plane, which is actually what's shown here. It's like straight down the midline of the person. The frontal or coronal plane sort of like goes down the head this way. It doesn't necessarily have to be through the head, but like through this direction. And the reason it's called a coronal plane is because corona means crown. And so it sort of like goes around your head like a crown does. And a transverse plane is just horizontal through the body. There's also a fourth type of plane called oblique, and that's just like sort of diagonal. That's less commonly used, so it's not shown here. But sometimes you might use an oblique plane to get like special look at like a really specific structure, but it's not too commonly used. So here we have another exercise. See if you can try and identify the plane of each section below. I'll give you a hint. The first two are brain. I know like the second one looks a little bit weird maybe. And the third one is a pelvis. So try and figure out which direction it is. And again, you can take a look at the hidden answer slide later on. All right. Last topic, I believe, for today is the 4 types of tissue. So I mentioned this like really briefly before, but basically the study of tissue is called histology, and there's a great link here at the bottom that teaches you all about histology, and they also have like some microscope pictures and stuff. So definitely take a look at that. I really recommend that resource. And there are 4 basic types of tissue. Epithelial tissue covers surfaces, connective tissue fills space, muscle promotes movement, and nerves transmit signals. Okay, so here are some like microscope pictures of each of the 4 types. So on the left, we see epithelial tissue. And you see the epithelia is sometimes in layers, which is the case here. It doesn't have to be in layers. It can just like be a single layer surrounding a structure, and that's okay. But what's really key here is that like you see this like open space. This could be like the inside of an organ, and we call this open space inside the organ the lumen. And so that would like line the interior of the organ. On the right-hand side here, we see muscle. This is striated muscle, which means it's striped. Like if you look really close, you can see little stripes along the cells. And generally muscle cells they show up pink because that's how they stain. And they're like long cylindrical cells. Okay, on the left here, you see two different types of connective tissue. Connective tissue is very, very diverse. There are many different types. So there's dense regular and dense irregular that are shown here. There's also liquid connective tissue. In fact, blood is actually a type of connective tissue. So yeah, it's very diverse, but generally speaking, most like solid types of connective tissue have a lot of fibers, and that's like sort of the squiggly lines that you see here. And on the right-hand side, we have nervous tissue. So you see like the star-shaped looking cells with long projections. Those are neurons. So we won't really be talking too much about nervous tissue this year though. Okay, so that's really all I had to say for this unit. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to send them my way. And everybody take care and have a great week.